The transport ship landed with a soft thud on the Academy grounds. Steam rose from its hull as the engines cooled in the morning air. Students pressed their faces against classroom windows, watching as a single figure walked down the ramp. Commander Vexthara moved slowly across the landing pad. 4 arms hung at her sides, and her tall, thin body cast a long shadow in the sunlight. Scars covered her dark blue skin like a map of old battles. One eye was gone, replaced by a glowing metal piece that clicked softly as it moved. The students had never seen a Kavari warrior before. Most had only read about them in books. They whispered to each other as Vexthara walked past their windows. Some pointed at the deep burns on her arms. Others stared at the way she limped on her left leg. Professor Keltar waited at the academy entrance. He was a small, round creature with gray skin and kind eyes. He had taught war history for 30 years, but he looked nervous today. His hands shook slightly as he greeted the veteran. "Commander Vexthara," he said, bowing low. "Welcome to the Korathian Military Academy. We are honored to have you speak to our students." Vexthara nodded but said nothing. Her metal eye focused on the professor for a moment, then swept across the academy buildings. Everything was clean and new. Fresh paint covered the walls. Young cadets walked in perfect lines between classes. "It has been 20 years since the war ended," Professor Keltar said as they walked. "Many of our students were not even born then. They know very little about what really happened." "What do you teach them?" Vexthara asked. Her voice was rough, like metal grinding against stone. The professor looked uncomfortable. "We follow the approved curriculum. The Terran Coalition War is covered in one chapter. The humans are mentioned as support forces. Minor allies, nothing more." Vexthara stopped walking. Her metal eye clicked as it turned toward the professor. "Support forces? Yes, well," Professor Keltar cleared his throat. "The official records show they provided limited assistance. Mostly supply runs and medical support. The real fighting was done by proper military forces." A sound came from Vexthara's throat. It might have been a laugh, but it held no humor. "I see. And who wrote these official records?" "The War History Committee, very respected scholars. They interviewed hundreds of veterans and reviewed all the battle reports." "Did they interview any veterans who fought with humans?" Professor Keltar paused. I'm not sure. The committee's work is classified above my level." They entered the main lecture hall. 200 young cadets sat in neat rows. They came from a dozen different species. Korathians, with their green skin and large eyes. Velkari, with their feathered crests. Even a few of the rock-like Tormani from the outer worlds. All of them looked eager and excited. This was their first guest lecture, from a real war veteran. They had heard stories about the great battles, the glorious victories, the honor of military service. They expected to hear more of the same. Professor Keltar walked to the front of the room. "Students, today we are privileged to hear from Commander Vexthara of the Kavari Planetary Defense Forces. She served with distinction in the Terran Coalition War and has agreed to share her experiences with us." The students applauded politely. Vexthara walked to the center of the stage. She stood quietly for a long moment, looking out at the young faces. Her metal eye swept across the room, clicking softly. "You look so young," she said finally. Her voice carried easily through the hall without any amplification. "So eager. So ready to die for glory." The applause died away. The students looked confused. This was not how guest lectures usually began. "Tell me," Vexthara continued, "what do you know about humans?" A Korathian cadet in the front row raised her hand. "They are a minor species from the Terra system. They joined the coalition near the end of the war. They provided supply ships and medical support." "Anything else?" A Velkari student spoke up. "Our textbooks say they were primitive, still using chemical explosives and metal projectile weapons. Nothing compared to plasma artillery or quantum disruptors." "I see." Vexthara nodded slowly. And these textbooks tell you that proper military forces won the war? Yes, ma'am, several students answered together. Vexthara was quiet for a moment. She seemed to be remembering something painful. Her good eye closed, and her metal eye dimmed. Let me tell you about the first time I saw a human in battle, she said. It was at Kepler Station, a critical supply hub that had been overrun by the Zerithian hive. Standard protocol called for careful orbital bombardment, followed by methodical ground assault. She began to pace across the stage. Her limp was more noticeable now. The humans volunteered for mop-up duty. Clean out any remaining enemies after the real soldiers did the important work. We thought it was fitting. Let the primitives handle the simple tasks while we planned the next major offensive. A few students chuckled. Vexthara's metal eye snapped toward them, and the laughter died instantly. 200 humans dropped from orbit in metal pods. No environmental suits, no air support, no backup plan. Just humans and their primitive weapons dropping straight into hell. The room was completely silent now. Even Professor Keltar had stopped taking notes. We watched from our ships as they landed in the station's damaged sections. Places where the hull had been breached. Where there was no air, no heat, no hope of survival. We expected them to die quickly. Vexthara stopped pacing and faced the students directly. Instead, they began hunting the Zerithians through the corridors. Room by room, level by level, fighting in vacuum with nothing but their chemical weapons, and what they called righteous fury. Her voice grew quieter, forcing the students to lean forward to hear. When their weapons overheated, they used their own blood as coolant. When they ran out of ammunition, they used their tools as clubs. When they were outnumbered 10-1, they didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They just kept fighting. A student in the back raised her hand, trembling. How? How long did it take them to clear the station? 6 hours, Vexthara said. 6 hours to do what we estimated would take 3 days with a full assault force. The metal eye clicked as it focused on different students around the room. When we finally dared to board the station, we found something that changed everything I thought I knew about war. We found Zerithian warriors. Beings that feel no fear. That know no concept of retreat. These creatures were huddled in corners, too terrified to move. Professor Keltar cleared his throat nervously. Commander, perhaps we should discuss more conventional tactics. Vexthara turned her metal eye toward him. The professor fell silent. You have been taught lies about the humans, she said, addressing the students again. Comfortable lies that help you sleep at night. Today, I am going to tell you the truth. I am going to tell you why every military strategist in the galaxy now studies human combat methods, and why many of us wake up screaming their names. The lecture hall was so quiet that the only sound was the soft clicking of Vexthara's artificial eye as it moved from student to student. By the time I am finished today, you will understand why the real question is not how we won the war against the humans. The real question is whether we survived it. Vexthara walked to the large display screen behind her. With one of her forearms, she activated the holographic projector. The image of Kepler Station appeared in the air above the students. The massive structure looked like a giant metal flower, with dozens of arms reaching out into space. This was Kepler Station 3 days before the human assault, she said. 20 million souls lived and worked here. Families, scientists, traders from across the galaxy. It was one of our most important supply centers. She touched a control, and the image changed. Now the station was dark and twisted. Huge holes had been torn in its sides. Pieces of metal floated around it like deadly snow. This was Kepler Station after the Zerithian hive found it. A student raised her hand. What exactly are the Zerithians? Our books don't say much about them. Vexthara's good eye fixed on the young cadet. Imagine the worst nightmare you have ever had. Now imagine that nightmare can think, can plan, can hate. The Zerithians are living weapons bred for one purpose, to kill everything that is not them. She changed the image again. Now it showed creatures that made several students gasp in horror. The Zerithians looked like giant insects. but wrong somehow. Too many legs, too many eyes, claws that dripped with acid. They do not take prisoners. They do not negotiate. They consume everything in their path and use the remains to build more of themselves. When they took Kepler Station, 20 million beings became raw material for their war machine. The room was completely silent except for the soft hum of the projector. I was serving as communications officer aboard the battleship Star's Edge. We were part of a coalition fleet of 300 ships, the finest military vessels in the galaxy. Our mission was simple: retake Kepler Station and destroy the Zerithian forces there. Vexthera began pacing again, her metal eye clicking softly. The plan was perfect. Standard military doctrine. First, orbital bombardment to weaken their defenses. Then careful insertion of assault teams in full environmental gear. Secure the outer rings, establish supply lines, advance methodically toward the core. She stopped and looked directly at a group of Corathian cadets. The humans had a different idea. A new image appeared above them. It showed a single human ship, much smaller than the coalition vessels. It looked rough and simple compared to the sleek alien warships. The Terra's Hammer, a converted mining ship with 300 humans aboard. Their commander was a woman named Captain Sarah Chen. She was 32 years old and had never fought in a real war before. Vexthera touched the controls again. Now they could see the interior of the human ship. Soldiers sat in metal chairs, checking their weapons. Their equipment looked ancient compared to alien technology. Captain Chen requested permission to speak with Admiral Vortash, our fleet commander. The admiral agreed, thinking it would be polite to listen to the primitive allies. The display showed a recording of that conversation. Admiral Vortash was a massive creature with 6 arms and skin like polished stone. He looked down at the small human woman on his screen. Captain Chen, the admiral's recorded voice said, "We appreciate your offer to help, but this is a complex military operation. Perhaps your people could assist with supply runs after we secure the station." The human woman on the screen was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was calm and steady. "Admiral, with respect, every minute we wait, the Zerithians are turning human civilians into more weapons. I'm not asking for permission, I'm telling you what we're going to do." Several students laughed at this. A human telling a fleet admiral what to do seemed ridiculous. Vexthera's metal eye clicked toward them. "You find this funny? Let me show you what happened next." The display changed to show the human ship moving away from the fleet. It headed straight toward Kepler Station, ignoring all the admiral's commands to return. "We thought they were committing suicide," Vexthera said. "A single ship against thousands of Zerithians? It seemed like madness." The image zoomed in to show the human ship approaching the station. Suddenly, hundreds of small objects shot out from it. "Drop pods," Vexthera explained. "Metal boxes barely big enough for one person. No life support systems. No landing rockets. Just humans inside metal coffins, falling toward the station." A Velkari student raised her hand. "But how could they survive? The station had no atmosphere in the damaged sections." "That," Vexthera said quietly, "was when we learned our first lesson about humans. They do not think about survival the same way we do." The display showed the pods smashing into the station's hull. They hit with tremendous force, punching through the metal walls and disappearing inside. Each pod contained one human soldier with enough air for exactly 10 minutes. No environmental suits. No backup systems. Just 10 minutes to accomplish their mission, or die trying. She paused to let this sink in. We expected them to secure a small area and wait for rescue. Instead, we began receiving signals from throughout the station. The humans had scattered themselves across 50 different sections and were all moving toward the center. The display now showed a map of the station with dozens of red dots moving through the corridors. I was monitoring communications from the coalition fleet when the first reports came in. Zerithian war screams echoing through the station's corridors. But these were not sounds of victory, they were sounds of fear. A student in the back row spoke up, "But Zerithians don't feel fear. Everyone knows that. Vexisthera turned to face him. That is what we thought too. Until we heard the recordings. She activated an audio file. Horrible screeching sounds filled the lecture hall. They were clearly alien voices. But even the students could hear the panic in them. The Zerithians were calling for reinforcements, Vexthera translated. They were reporting that the humans were not behaving like any enemy they had ever faced. She started a video feed from inside the station. The image was grainy and dark, but they could see a long corridor filled with twisted metal and alien technology. This is from a security camera in Section 12. Watch, carefully. A human figure appeared in the corridor. He was wearing simple military clothing and carrying a basic rifle. He moved carefully through the shadows, checking every corner. Suddenly, 3 Zerithians dropped from the ceiling above him. The students gasped. The creatures were twice his size and armed with natural weapons that could cut through metal. What happened next made no sense to alien military thinking. Instead of retreating or calling for backup, the human dropped his rifle and pulled out a knife. A simple metal blade. Then he charged directly at the Zerithians. "This is impossible," whispered a Tormani student. "No single warrior can fight 3 Zerithians hand to hand." The recording showed the human rolling between the creature's legs, slashing with his knife. When one Zerithian fell, he grabbed its acid claws and used them as weapons against the other 2. The fight lasted 30 seconds. When it ended, all 3 Zerithians were dead, and the human was still standing. He picked up his rifle and continued down the corridor as if nothing had happened. We recorded 847 similar encounters across the station, Vexthera said. Each time, humans fought with weapons and tactics that made no logical sense. They used their own blood to cool overheated equipment. They turned Zerithian weapons against their owners. They fought in areas with no air, no gravity, no hope of rescue. The display showed more scenes. Humans welding doors shut to trap enemies inside. Humans detonating their own equipment to collapse tunnels full of Zerithians. Humans continuing to fight even after suffering wounds that should have killed them instantly. After 4 hours, the Zerithians stopped attacking and began retreating toward the station's core. We had never seen them retreat from anything before. A new image appeared. It showed hundreds of Zerithians huddled together in the station's central chamber. The creatures that normally felt no fear were pressed against each other like frightened children. 2 hours later, the humans reached the central chamber. There were only 47 of them left alive, but they had cornered nearly 1,000 Zerithians. The final video clip showed the moment when the humans entered the central chamber. The Zerithians saw them coming and began making sounds that no alien had ever heard from them before. Sounds of pure terror. The remaining humans did not even need to fire a shot, Vexthara said. The Zerithians surrendered. Creatures that had never known fear, that had conquered dozens of worlds, gave up without a fight because they were too afraid to face 47 humans with simple weapons. She turned off the display and faced the students. When our assault teams finally boarded the station 6 hours later, we found something that changed everything. We found humans sitting calmly in the central chamber, sharing rations with their prisoners. Captain Chen was cleaning her knife and humming a song from her home world. Vexthera's metal eye focused on each student in turn. That was when we realized that the war was not going to be what we expected. We thought we were fighting alongside primitive allies against a terrible enemy. Instead, we discovered that we had allied ourselves with something far more frightening than the Zerithians could ever be. The lecture hall remained silent for a long moment. The humans did not see this as a great victory. Vexthara continued. To them, it was just another day's work. Captain Chen filed her report in 3 sentences. Station secured. Enemy neutralized. Ready for next assignment. She walked closer to the students. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about those 47 humans, calmly eating dinner surrounded by the corpses of creatures that had terrorized the galaxy for centuries. And I began to wonder, what kind of species produces warriors like that? Vexthara's voice dropped to almost a whisper. It would take me 18 more months to learn the answer to that question. 18 months to understand that Kepler Station was not humanity showing us their strength. It was humanity holding back. Vexthara stood quietly for several minutes, looking out at the students. Many of them seemed uncomfortable now. The stories they had heard were nothing like the glorious tales in their textbooks. 18 months after Kepler Station, she said finally, I was captured during the siege of Proxima Fortress. She began walking again, her footsteps echoing in the silent hall. By then, I had been promoted to intelligence commander. My job was to analyze human battle tactics and find weaknesses we could exploit. I had watched dozens of engagements, studied hundreds of reports, interviewed countless survivors. A young Corathian cadet raised her hand. What did you learn about their weaknesses? Vexthera's metal eye clicked as it focused on the student. That was the problem. I could not find any. She stopped walking and faced the class. Every military force has predictable patterns. They favor certain tactics. They avoid certain risks. They protect their leaders and preserve their equipment. Humans did none of these things. The display screen lit up again, showing battle maps and tactical analyses. Human forces would attack where no sane commander would expect. They would sacrifice expensive equipment to save a single wounded soldier. Their leaders fought on the front lines instead of staying safely behind their armies. She pointed to one of the battle maps. At the Battle of Vega Prime, a human general named Marcus Rodriguez was leading an assault on a Corathian weapons depot. Standard tactics called for him to coordinate the attack from his command ship. The image changed to show a recording from that battle. Explosions lit up the night as human soldiers advanced across an open field under heavy fire. Instead, General Rodriguez grabbed a rifle and charged with his troops. When his soldiers saw their general running beside them, they fought harder than any beings I have ever witnessed. They took the depot in 40 minutes instead of the 3 days our computer models predicted. A Velkari student spoke up. That sounds like poor leadership. A general's job is to plan, not to fight. That is what I thought too, Vexthera replied. Until I was captured and learned what human leadership really means. The screen showed a new image, a massive fortress built into an asteroid. Weapons platforms surrounded it like a metal forest. Proxima Fortress was our most important strategic position. It controlled the jump routes to 3-star systems. The coalition had been trying to take it for 6 months without success. She touched the controls, and the image zoomed in to show thousands of ships surrounding the fortress. I was part of the command staff, analyzing human attack patterns. We thought we understood how they operated by then. Fast strikes, brutal efficiency, no concern for their own losses. The display changed to show tactical projections and battle plans. We prepared for a direct assault, extra shields, more weapons, additional troops. We were ready for anything the humans might throw at us. Vexthera's voice grew quieter. What we were not prepared for was patience. A confused murmur ran through the students. The humans sat outside our weapons range for 3 weeks. They did nothing. No attacks, no probes, no communications. They just waited. She began pacing again. Our commander, General Tekvar, thought it was a trap. He kept all forces on high alert. No one was allowed to leave their posts. Supply runs were canceled. Medical leave was denied. The display showed the interior of the fortress. Alien soldiers looked tired and stressed, constantly checking their weapons and scanning empty space. After 2 weeks of this, soldiers began making mistakes. Equipment failures increased, morale dropped. But still, the humans waited. A student raised her hand. What were they waiting for? For us to defeat ourselves, Vexthera answered. On day 21, a tired Corathian engineer made an error in the shield generator. The entire defensive grid went down for exactly 97 seconds. The image showed the human fleet suddenly coming to life. Ships that had been drifting quietly in space roared forward with incredible speed. 97 seconds was all they needed. Human strike teams landed in 12 different locations while our shields were down. By the time we got our defenses back online, they were already inside. Vexthera stopped pacing and looked directly at the students. I was in the command center when they breached our doors. I expected them to burst in shooting, like they did at Kepler Station. Instead, a single human woman walked in calmly and asked to speak with whoever was in charge. The screen showed a security recording from that day. A small woman in human military uniform stood in the doorway of the command center. Alien soldiers pointed dozens of weapons at her, but she seemed completely unafraid. This was Colonel Sarah Chen, the same officer who had led the assault on Kepler Station. She was older now, and her hands shook constantly from combat stimulants. In the recording, Colonel Chen walked forward slowly. Her voice was clear and calm as she spoke to the Korathian officers. "I am Colonel Sarah Chen of the Human Expeditionary Force. I am here to accept your surrender." The alien commander in the recording laughed. "Surrender? You have a handful of soldiers against our entire garrison." Colonel Chen smiled sadly. "Sir, your garrison surrendered 20 minutes ago. I'm just here to make it official." One of the students gasped. "How is that possible?" Vexthera activated another video feed. It showed corridors throughout the fortress where Korathian soldiers sat on the floor with their weapons placed carefully beside them. They were not injured. They were not restrained. They had simply stopped fighting. "The humans had done something we thought was impossible," Vexthera explained. "They had convinced our soldiers to give up without killing a single one of them." She paused to let this sink in. "I was taken prisoner along with the rest of the command staff. According to military protocol, we expected to be held in comfortable detention until a prisoner exchange could be arranged." The display changed to show a simple room with basic furniture and a single chair. Instead, Colonel Chen brought me to an interrogation room, but she did not ask me any questions. She just showed me recordings. Vexthara's voice became strained. The first recording was from a place called New Geneva, a human colony world with 4 million people. I watched Korathian ships in orbit above the planet. The image on the screen showed a beautiful world covered in green forests and blue oceans. Human cities dotted the landscape like jewels. Our intelligence briefings had told us this was a major military installation. A weapons manufacturing center. A legitimate target. A legitimate target. The recording continued. Missiles fell from the Korathian ships toward the planet's surface. I watched those missiles hit the surface. I expected to see military bases exploding, weapons factories destroyed. Instead, I saw schools burning, hospitals collapsing, children running through streets filled with poison gas. Several students looked sick. One Korathian cadet stood up and rushed out of the room. Colonel Chen sat beside me as we watched 40,000 civilians die from nerve gas. Vexthera continued. She did not say anything. She just let me see what acceptable casualties looked like to my own commanders. The recording showed human families trying to reach evacuation ships. Korathian fighters shot down the rescue vessels as they tried to escape. When the recording ended, Colonel Chen finally spoke. She said, "Your fleet command ordered this strike. They told you it was a military target. I'm going to show you what military targets really look like." A new recording began. This one showed actual human military bases. Soldiers in training. Weapons being manufactured. Ships being built. These were the real military targets, Vexthera said. Bases that our fleet had avoided attacking because they were too well defended. Instead, my commanders had chosen to kill civilians and call them soldiers. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Vexthera's breathing. I sat in that room for 6 hours, watching recording after recording. 27 human colony worlds. 160 million civilians. All killed by weapons that I had helped plan, ships that I had helped coordinate. She stopped talking and stood very still. Colonel Chen showed me communication logs from our own command ships. Orders that clearly identified the targets as civilian populations. Messages discussing how terror attacks would break human morale faster than military victories. A student in the back row spoke quietly. "But that's against every rule of warfare." "Yes," Vexthera replied. "It is." And every single Korathian officer followed those orders without question. Including me. The display showed one final recording. It was from Vexthara's own ship, showing her receiving orders to target another human colony. "I watched myself agreeing to help murder another million humans," she said. "I watched myself smile as I planned the most efficient way to kill children. She turned away from the screen. When the recordings ended, Colonel Chen made me an offer. She said, "Join us, and help us end this war quickly. Stay with them, and watch us burn every Korathian world to ash, because that's what your leaders just taught us is acceptable." Vexthara faced the students again. I realized then that the humans were not fighting for territory or resources or political power. They were fighting for survival against an enemy that had already decided genocide was the solution. She walked closer to the front row of students. Colonel Chen did not torture me for information. She did not threaten me with death. She simply showed me the truth about who I was working for and who I was fighting against. Her metal eye clicked softly. I defected that day because I finally understood that the humans were not the monsters in this war. We were. A long silence filled the room. But that was not the end of the story, Vexthara said quietly. That was when I learned what humans do to enemies who make them truly angry, and why victory against humanity is sometimes worse than defeat. Vexthara walked to the side of the lecture hall and leaned against the wall. Her metal eye dimmed slightly, as if she was accessing old memories that hurt to recall. After my defection, I was assigned to the Human Expeditionary Force as an intelligence advisor, she said. I thought I understood what human warfare looked like. I had seen Kepler Station. I had witnessed their tactical abilities. She pushed herself away from the wall and began pacing again. I was wrong. What I had seen before was humans fighting defensively, reacting to enemy attacks. Now, I was about to see what happens when humans go on the offensive. The display screen activated, showing a star map with several systems highlighted in red. 6 months after my capture, the Human Command decided to launch Operation Cleansing Light. The goal was to liberate the Terran system, which had been under Korathian control for 2 years. She pointed to the largest red marker on the map. Terran Prime was the key target. Home to 12 billion beings from 40 different species, the Korathians had turned it into a fortress world, with orbital defenses and a garrison of 2 million soldiers. A student raised her hand. How many human troops were assigned to the assault? 40,000, Vexthara replied. The students looked confused. Several began whispering to each other about the impossible odds. Yes, Vexthara continued. You understand the problem. Standard military doctrine says you need at least equal numbers to attack a fortified position. The humans were outnumbered 50-1. She touched the display controls, and the image changed to show detailed scans of Terran Prime's defenses. The planet was protected by 600 orbital weapons platforms. Energy shields covered all major population centers. Underground bunkers could hold the entire garrison for months. A Tormani student spoke up. This sounds like suicide. What was their plan? Vexthara's expression became grim. That was when I learned that humans do not think about war the way we do. Where we see military problems to be solved with superior force, they see psychological puzzles to be solved with superior understanding. The display changed to show the human fleet approaching the Terran system. The ships looked small and fragile compared to the massive orbital defenses. Admiral Chen commanded the fleet. Yes, the same Sarah Chen I had met before. She had been promoted after her success at Proxima Fortress. The image zoomed in to show the bridge of the human flagship. Admiral Chen stood calmly in the center, surrounded by officers studying various displays. I was on the bridge when we entered the system. The Korathian commander immediately sent a message demanding our surrender. Admiral Chen replied with a single word. No. She paused for effect. Then she gave the strangest military order I have ever heard. She told her troops to prepare for a cultural exchange. The students looked completely baffled. I thought I had misunderstood, Vexthara explained. But Admiral Chen began broadcasting on all frequencies. Not threats or demands, but music. Human music. Songs from Earth, performed by children's choirs. The display showed communication logs from that day. Thousands of messages flowing between human ships, all containing audio files and cultural data. For 12 hours, the human fleet sat at the edge of the system, playing music. Children singing lullabies. Orchestras performing symphonies. Simple folk songs from 100 different human cultures. A Velkari student raised her hand. What was the point of this? The humans were teaching the enemy who they were. Vexthara answered. Every song included biographical information about the performers. Their names, their ages, their families, their hopes and dreams. She activated an audio file. Sweet voices filled the lecture hall, singing in a language none of the students recognized. This particular song was performed by the New Geneva Children's Choir. 43 young humans between the ages of 6 and 16. The transmission included pictures of each child, their favorite foods, their pet animals, their drawings of what they wanted to be when they grew up. The music stopped abruptly. All 43 of those children had been killed in the nerve gas attack I helped plan 6 months earlier. The silence in the room was deafening. The Korathian commander ordered his communications officer to stop receiving the human broadcasts. But it was too late. Soldiers throughout the fleet had already heard the songs, seen the pictures, learned the names. Vexthara began pacing faster. Then Admiral Chen gave her second order. Commence cultural integration. The display showed small ships leaving the human fleet. They moved slowly toward Terran Prime, making no effort to avoid the orbital defenses. Each ship contained 50 human soldiers and something we had never seen before. Zerithian biotechnology that had been modified by human scientists. A student interrupted. But the Zerithians were your enemies too. How did humans get their technology? After Kepler Station, the humans began studying every Zerithian corpse they could find, Vexthara explained. They learned how their neural networks functioned, how their memory systems worked, how their thoughts connected to each other. She stopped pacing and faced the students directly. The humans had created a virus that could target Korathian neural implants, not to kill, but to transmit memories directly into our soldiers' minds. The implications of this hit the students like a physical blow. Several looked sick. Every Korathian soldier in the system suddenly began experiencing the final moments of human civilians. They felt the fear of children as nerve gas filled their schools. They experienced the desperation of parents trying to save their families. They lived through the deaths of every innocent person killed in the attacks. The display showed medical readings from Korathian ships. Brain activity patterns spiked wildly as soldiers collapsed at their posts. But the humans were not finished, Vexthara continued. The virus also transmitted the memories of the people those children could have become, the humans they would have loved, the discoveries they might have made, the songs they would never sing. Her voice grew quieter. Korathian soldiers found themselves mourning beings they had helped kill, grieving for futures that would never exist because of their own actions. She activated another recording. It showed the bridge of a Korathian warship, where officers were weeping openly, unable to control their emotional responses to the flood of human memories. Half the enemy fleet surrendered immediately, Vexthara said. Soldiers could not bring themselves to fire weapons at beings whose dreams they had shared. Commanders could not give orders to kill children whose laughter they had heard. And a Korathian student in the front row spoke with a shaking voice. What happened to the other half? They went insane. Vexthara replied simply. The human memories were too powerful, too real, too filled with love and loss. Minds that had been trained for war could not process the depth of emotion they were experiencing. The display showed ships drifting helplessly in space, their crews unable to function. Admiral Chen contacted the Korathian commander one final time. She offered medical assistance for the affected soldiers and safe passage for anyone who wanted to leave the system. She paused. She also made one additional offer. She said that any Korathian who wanted to understand what they had really been fighting could stay and help rebuild the worlds they had destroyed. The image changed to show human ships landing on Terran Prime. Soldiers emerged carrying medical supplies and construction equipment instead of weapons. I watched human engineers working alongside former enemy soldiers to repair damage from the war. I saw human doctors treating Korathian patients with the same care they gave their own wounded. Vexthara's metal eye focused on each student in turn. That was when I realized that the humans had not just defeated the Korathian forces at Terran Prime. They had converted them. Soldiers who had spent months trying to kill humans were now working desperately to save human lives. A long silence filled the room. But the most frightening part came later, she continued. Admiral Chen contacted every Corothian world simultaneously and broadcast the same neural virus to their entire populations. The students gasped. Overnight, 200 billion Corothians experienced the memories of human genocide victims. They felt what it was like to die from weapons they had supported, to lose children to wars they had approved. The display showed scenes from Corothian worlds. Crowds gathered in city centers, many weeping, others standing in shocked silence. The Corothian government fell within a week, Vexthera said, not because of military defeat, but because their own people could no longer support a war they finally understood. She walked closer to the students. The humans ended the war not by killing their enemies, but by forcing them to feel empathy. They weaponized compassion itself. A student in the back row raised her hand, trembling. But that's not how war is supposed to work. No. Vexthera agreed. It is not. Wars are supposed to be fought by soldiers against soldiers, with weapons that destroy bodies and machines. The humans created a weapon that destroyed hatred itself. She returned to the center of the stage. I served with the Human Expeditionary Force for another 6 months, helping with reconstruction efforts. Every day, I watched former enemies working together to repair the damage of war. Every day, I saw beings who had been filled with hate, learning to care for each other. Her voice became very quiet. And every day, I wondered, if humans could weaponize compassion, if they could turn love into a tool of war, what else might they be capable of? What other emotions could they use as weapons? Vexthara looked out at the students one final time. I was about to find out that victory against humanity comes with a price that no one expects to pay. A price that changes not just how you fight, but who you are. Vexthara stood quietly for a long moment, her metal eye clicking softly as it moved across the faces of the students. The lecture hall felt different now. The eager excitement from the beginning had been replaced by something heavier, darker. A young Corothian cadet in the front row finally broke the silence. Commander, if the humans were so powerful, so different from us, why did the war end? Why aren't they ruling the galaxy now? Vexthara's expression did not change, but something shifted in her posture. She seemed to grow taller, more imposing. Who says they are not? The question hung in the air like a poison cloud. You assume that ruling means sitting on thrones and giving orders, she continued. You think power means having the biggest fleet or the strongest weapons. That is not how humans think about conquest. She began walking among the students now, moving down the aisles between their seats. Several leaned away as she passed. Let me ask you something else, she said. What have you learned in your military classes about acceptable casualties in warfare? A Velkari student answered confidently. Current doctrine allows for up to 15% civilian casualties in military operations, provided the strategic value justifies the loss. And where did this doctrine come from? The student looked confused. It's standard across all coalition forces. It was established after the war. Vexthara nodded slowly. Yes, after the war. And who do you think created these new standards? Understanding began to dawn on some of the students' faces. Before the Terran Coalition War, Vexthara explained, civilian casualties were considered unavoidable, but regrettable. Military commanders tried to minimize them when possible, but accepted them when necessary. She stopped walking and faced the class. After the war, the concept of acceptable civilian casualties became part of standard military thinking. We began calculating exactly how many innocents we were willing to kill to achieve our objectives. The display screen activated, showing military training manuals from across the galaxy. These are current tactical handbooks used by every major military force. Notice the sections on psychological warfare, terror tactics, and civilian targeting. These concepts did not exist in our military thinking before we fought the humans. A student raised her hand nervously. But surely that's just natural military evolution? Is it? Vexthara asked. Let me show you something else. The display changed to show personnel records from various alien military forces. Human names appeared regularly throughout the command structures. Admiral Sarah Chen, formerly of the Human Expeditionary Force, now serves as strategic advisor to the Carathian Fleet Command. General Marcus Rodriguez coordinates training programs for the Velkari Defense Corps. Captain James Morrison teaches combat psychology at the Zerithian Military Academy. More names scrolled past. Hundreds of them. In the 20 years since the war ended, human advisors have integrated into every major military organization in the galaxy. They teach our officers, design our training programs, and help plan our defensive strategies. A Tormani student spoke up. That sounds like cooperation, not conquest. Does it? Vexthera's metal eye fixed on him. Tell me, what have you been taught about the proper response to enemy civilians during wartime? The student recited automatically. Civilian populations that support enemy forces become legitimate targets. Terror tactics can be effective tools for breaking enemy morale. The goal is to make the cost of resistance higher than the cost of surrender. Vexthara nodded grimly. 25 years ago, any officer who suggested targeting civilians would have been court-martialed and imprisoned. Now it is standard doctrine taught to every cadet in this academy. She began pacing again. The humans did not need to conquer us with fleets and armies. They convinced us to conquer ourselves by teaching us to think like they do. The display showed battle reports from recent conflicts across the galaxy. Each one described tactics that would have been considered war crimes before the human war. The Centauri rebellion was crushed using psychological warfare that drove entire populations to madness. The vegan trade dispute ended when coalition forces threatened to virus bomb civilian worlds. The Proxima border war featured systematic targeting of schools and hospitals to break enemy morale. She stopped pacing and faced the students directly. Every single one of these conflicts was fought using human tactical doctrine. Every single one was planned by officers trained in human military academies or advised by human consultants. A horrified whisper ran through the students. But why? A student asked. Why would humans want us to become like them? Because, Vexthara said quietly, that is how they ensure they will never have to fight alone again. She activated a new display, showing galactic political maps from before and after the war. Before the war, conflicts were limited in scope. Species fought for specific objectives using conventional tactics. Wars ended when one side achieved victory or negotiated peace. The display changed to show current political situations. Now look at our galaxy. Ongoing conflicts on 47 worlds, terrorist attacks on civilian populations, entire species living in fear of their neighbors, wars that no longer end because victory is no longer the goal. A student raised her hand shakily. What is the goal now? Control, Vexthara answered. Not control of territory or resources, but control of how we think about war itself. She walked to the center of the stage. Humans understood something that the rest of us missed. The greatest victory is not defeating your enemies. It is making your enemies become you. The lecture hall was completely silent, except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. Every species that fought against humanity learned to use human tactics. Every government that opposed them adopted human strategies. Every military that faced them began training soldiers to think like human soldiers. She paused. And now, when conflicts arise anywhere in the galaxy, they are resolved using human methods. Violence, terror, psychological warfare, the tools that once belonged only to humanity have become the standard weapons of everyone. A Carathian student stood up suddenly. But we won the war, the official records say. The official records, Vexthara interrupted, were written by beings who had learned to think like humans. Can you not see the irony? We declared victory using human definitions of what victory means. She gestured toward the display. Look at yourselves. Look at what you are being taught in this academy. You study human battle tactics. You memorize human strategic principles. You are being trained to solve problems the way humans solve them. The metal eye clicked as it focused on different students. When you graduate and take command positions, what kind of orders will you give? When you face your first crisis, what methods will you use? When civilians get in the way of your objectives, what will you do to them? Several students looked sick. You will do exactly what humans would do. Vexthara continued. Because that is what you have been taught. That is what we have all been taught. She walked back to the front of the room. I have traveled to 200 worlds since the war ended. I have spoken with veterans from a dozen species. Every single one tells the same story. They can no longer remember who they were before they learned to fight like humans. Her voice became softer. Sadder. We did not lose the war to human weapons or human ships. We lost it to human ideas. Ideas about what strength means. About how problems should be solved. About what we are willing to do to survive. She faced the students one final time. You ask why I tell these stories to young cadets who were not even born when the war ended. I tell them because you are living proof of humanity's victory. The students looked confused. Look around this room, she said. You come from species that once prided themselves on honor, on protecting the innocent, on fighting only when necessary. Your ancestors would be horrified by what you are being taught to consider normal. She pointed at the Korathian students. Your people once believed that courage meant protecting those weaker than yourself. She pointed at the Velkari. Your species taught that true strength came from wisdom and restraint. She pointed at the Tormani. Your culture held that war should always be the last option, used only when all else failed. Her metal eye swept across all of them. Now you sit here learning how to kill civilians efficiently. You study techniques for breaking enemy morale through terror. You plan strategies that would have been called evil by your own grandparents. A long silence filled the room. That is humanity's true victory, Vexthara said. Not that they defeated us in battle, but that they made us become the kind of beings who would fight such battles. She began walking toward the exit. When you leave here today, you will go to classes on psychological warfare and civilian targeting. You will study methods of torture and terror. You will learn to think of other beings as obstacles to be removed, rather than lives to be protected. She paused at the door. And you will think this is normal. You will think this is how military forces have always operated. Because the humans did not just change how we fight wars, they changed how we think about what we are fighting for. The door opened with a soft hiss. That is why I wake up screaming, she said without turning around. Not because I remember human weapons or human tactics, but because I can no longer remember what it felt like to be the person I was before I learned to think like a human. She stepped through the doorway. Sleep well, cadets. And when you dream tonight, try to remember what your ancestors would think of the beings you are becoming. The door closed behind her with a final, soft click. The students sat in absolute silence for long minutes after she left. Some stared at their hands. Others looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. A few were quietly crying. None of them would sleep well that night. And in academies across the galaxy, other veterans would tell similar stories to other students, planting seeds of doubt about victories that might have been defeats, about conquests that looked like corruptions, but it was too late to change course now. The transformation was complete. Humanity had won the greatest victory in galactic history. They had made everyone else become human, and there was no going back.